Last time, I spoke on the topic of Christians as enemies of the state, employing Mark 1, verses 9 through 15 as my text. Briefly, I argued that the nature of statism means that Christians will necessarily be enemies of the state. I hope I was clear that this enmity would not be because the Christian wants it that way. It really is the state at enmity with the church. Now, people mean different things by using the term statism. On a Christian understanding, statism would be the condition in which a body politic have organized themselves or see themselves as a mystical body of sorts. Now, since we, Christians, are already members of a mystical body, there's bound to be tension for at least 3 reasons, paraphrasing observations by R.J. Rushduni. First, as a mystical body, the state is the religious order, a church holding to a common faith. Second, the state is the total sovereign order and has complete jurisdiction over every sphere of life and a prior claim on all loyalties. Third, and finally, the state is preoccupied with the secular or the worldly, insisting on the priority of the temporal over the eternal. And since the state is not inclined to recognize the spiritual or the eternal, it usually recognizes no transcendent claims upon itself. It is impossible that the state will not view those who resist or oppose these 3 characteristics as mortal enemies. Now, understandably, I've been asked to reconcile those remarks with a text such as Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, which I'm going to attempt today. So here then is our text. Quoting now, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." Now, in understanding this passage, we have to give attention to where this passage appears in the epistle, which was written by St. Paul to introduce himself to the church in Rome. Specifically, we need to understand that this chapter, as well as those which follow, is a continuation of matters he began discussing in chapter 12. The first 11 chapters are devoted to doctrinal matters, such as man's just condemnation by God, justification by faith, sanctification, the condition and position of Israel in salvation history. In chapter 12, St. Paul shifts his attention to application. Because of the truth of what he has said in the previous 11 chapters, he exhorts his readers, beginning Romans 12, verse 1, to present their bodies as living and holy sacrifices, as their spiritual service of worship, and to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. So, chapter 13 is part of a brief exposition of this priestly, transformed life. I can't think of a better introduction to this passage than the one Calvin gives. Quoting now, "There are always some tumultuous spirits who believe that the kingdom of Christ cannot be sufficiently elevated unless all earthly powers be abolished, and that they cannot enjoy the liberty given by him except they shake off every yoke of human subjection. This error possessed the minds of the Jews above all others, for it seemed to them disgraceful that the offspring of Abraham, whose kingdom flourished before the Redeemer's coming, should now, after his appearance, continue in submission to another power. There was also another thing which alienated the Jews, no less than the Gentiles, from their rulers, because they all not only hated piety, but also persecuted religion with the most hostile feelings. Hence it seemed unreasonable to acknowledge them for legitimate princes and rulers, who were attempting to take away the kingdom from Christ, the only Lord of heaven and earth. So, this passage is a corrective of just this sort of erroneous thinking. It's tempting to believe that since we live under the authority of Jesus Christ, we have no need of other authorities. Every person, says St. Paul, is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. So in a letter addressed to Christians, it is significant that St. Paul begins this section by asserting that every person is to submit to governing authority, or higher powers, as the KJV puts it, King James Version puts it. I want to draw your attention to the Greek text here. While our translations employ the definite article, the governing authorities, the Greek text doesn't. Now, one doesn't always want to make too much of this sort of thing. There are places in the Greek text with an absent definite article, which clearly require it. But one shouldn't read every absent article as being irrelevant. When one sees an article missing, where one should expect an article, it should at least be looked at more closely. Now, where we have the governing authorities, the Greek text has governing authorities, or higher powers. Every person, without exception, is to be in subjection to governing authorities. Now, since the context quite clearly refers to what we understand as government, more correctly civil government, we would best understand this to mean that every person is to be in subjection to civil authorities. I think the larger context, including the historical context, justifies this understanding, along with the fact that St. Peter also felt the need to give his flock a similar instruction in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 and 14. So, to those who might be inclined to think that living under the direct lordship of Jesus Christ means an exemption from submission to civil authority, St. Paul emphasizes his point by informing them that civil government has been ordained by God himself. It follows, then, that rejecting this institution is to reject the God who ordained it, not very unlike those who would forbid marriage, another institution ordained by God. Now I want to draw your attention to the words resist and oppose in verse 2. And these two words can connote physical resistance and opposition, but they are also used to express contradiction in the argumentative sense. And I should point out I'm talking about the Greek text now. In Acts chapter 18, verse 6, recording an experience Paul had in Corinth, reasoning in the synagogues and testifying that Jesus is the Messiah, Luke writes that when they resisted and blasphemed, Paul shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own hands. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Now here, the resistance is rhetorical. In Luke chapter 21, verse 15, Jesus tells his disciples, "I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute." Now in this passage also, the term refute is translated oppose in Romans chapter 13, verse 2. Now think about what this would mean when St. Paul says that he who resists authority opposes the ordinance of God. He could be talking about open rebellion, but open rebellion begins in rhetoric. So it is likely that the focus here is rhetorical. To position an argument against the existence and authority of civil government is to argue and ultimately rebel against God himself. So continuing with verse 3, St. Paul says, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." Now, it shouldn't be too difficult to see why St. Paul would mention fear. You think about the experience of the people of God with civil government, specifically those of various empires, even petty kingdoms. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Romans. That history offers many reasons to fear civil government. But St. Paul is talking about civil government purely as an institution, and he himself was hardly unaware of that history. It is civil government per se that is not a cause of fear. Certainly, some given government may be a cause of fear, but that is not something bound up in the very nature of civil government. And quite the contrary, he says, civil government is a minister of God, a minister who serves God by executing wrath, God's wrath, on evildoers. As an institution per se, the only people who need fear civil government are those who practice evil. Civil government, purely as an institution, ordained by God himself, is not a cause of fear. Fear, we might say, is accidental, not essential, to the exercise of civil authority. It may help to think of St. Paul as talking about faithful civil government, that is, civil government which faithfully performs the services for which God ordained it. Then, contrast this with the sort of civil government which is a cause of fear to those who do good, apostate civil government. Now, this is an important distinction, and we need to pay some close attention to what Paul says is the ministry which civil government performs on God's behalf, the punishment of, or the execution of wrath upon, evildoers. Faithful civil government punishes evildoers, and we must be clear on this. Evil is defined by God, not by the governing authority, which is God's minister. The purpose for which God ordains civil government is to punish evil as he defines it. Now this raises the specter of theonomy, and the thought encounters a great deal of resistance due to the fact that God did not give written laws to all the nations. But we should take note of the fact that when God gave the law to Israel, he told them it would be a model for the Gentiles. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. Quoting now, "See, I have taught you statutes and judgment, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it, as is the Lord our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today?" End quote. Now, moreover, when God gave the law, he told the Israelites that the people from whom they were taking the land had violated these laws, and this is why he was taking it from them and giving it to the children of Abraham. I'm quoting now from Leviticus chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you lived, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accord with them. I am the Lord your God. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, by which a man may live if he does them. I am the Lord." Now skipping down to verse 24. "Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these things the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it. So the land has spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. For the men of the land who have been before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become defiled. So that the land will not spew you out, should you defile it, as it has spewed out the nations which have been before you. For whoever does any of these abominations, those persons who do so, shall be cut off from among their people. Thus you are to keep my charge, that you do not practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you, so as not to defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God." Now, hopefully, as you've read the prophets, you've noticed that when God pronounces judgment on the Gentiles, he employs the same moral standard he applies to the Hebrews. Amos, Nahum, and Habakkuk all declared the Lord's judgment on Gentile nations for violating moral standards found in the law. For example, slave trafficking. Compare Amos 1:6 with Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 24:7. Witchcraft. Compare Nahum 3 verse 4 with Exodus 22 verses 25 to 27 and Leviticus 19 verse 21. Also loan pledges. Compare Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 6 with Exodus 22 verses 25 to 27 and Deuteronomy 24 verse 6 and then verses 10 through 13. In fact, the law is the same standard to which St. Paul appeals in the first chapter of this very epistle in arguing his case against sinful man. And now I'm going to read Romans beginning at chapter 1 verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Now, time permitting, we could go through that catalog of sins and identify the precise provisions of the law that are violated. But for now, all we can say is that God has one standard of good, himself, revealed in his law. Conversely, he has only one standard of evil, any want of conformity to his will, as we find in the Westminster Shorter Catechism at question 14. Now, continuing in verse 5, St. Paul says, therefore, that is, because the institution of civil government is ordained by God, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. Note the use of the word wrath above in verse 4, where St. Paul refers to the civil government as a minister of God who serves him by bringing his wrath on the one who practices evil, not the wrath of the civil authority, not the wrath of the people, the wrath of God. Resistance to civil authority puts the resistors in peril of having that minister, whose existence they object to, execute God's wrath upon them. But this possibility is not the only thing we should consider. St. Paul also appeals to conscience. We should submit to governing authorities not only because of the possibility of their executing God's wrath against us, but also simply because God commands it, and disobeying God should strike at our conscience. And finally, because the governing authorities serve God, St. Paul's readers pay taxes. As he says, for because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Now, the reason I make specific mention here of St. Paul's readers paying taxes are, first, that we have to remember that this letter was written to them. We have to understand what he wrote to them and then make application to ourselves. Second, we have to understand that the teaching of this passage has to be relevant and applicable to any form of government, whether tribal, feudal, republican, or monarchical, provided that God's purpose for governing authorities is fulfilled, which is the punishment of evildoers. So, this must include forms of government not supported by taxes, such as the administration of justice by the heads of households, patris familias, under the 12 tables of the Roman law. Our understanding also has to take into account that the first words in Scripture having anything remotely to do with human government as we understand it, or the execution of sentence on evildoers, were not addressed to anyone or anything we would today recognize as a governing authority. If anything, they were addressed to patres familias, for they were addressed to Noah and his sons in Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. Quoting now, "Surely I will require your life blood. From every beast I will require it, and from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." Now, Noah and his sons clearly were not governing authorities as we understand the term today, but as heads of households, patres familias, they were in fact governing authorities, empowered by God to execute judgment, and presumably they were not supported by taxes. Now, as it happens, we live under a system of governing authorities relevantly similar to that of St. Paul's readers, and which is supported by taxes. So, we pay taxes for the same reason, to provide financial support to those who are devoted to the punishment of evildoers. And since the subject of taxes is one that comes up frequently in conversations among Christians when it comes to government, I want to take just a little bit of time to discuss it. Now, even if we wanted to, we couldn't get much in the way of tax policy from this passage. But, based strictly on this passage, we can note at least 5 things about taxes. 1. According to this passage, taxes constitute payment for services rendered, and those services, given they are performed by a minister of God, had better be rendered, and they better be excellent. The fact that they are not excellent, and if not mediocre, probably explains much of the antipathy that Christians have towards governing authorities today. Now, especially is this the case as the amount of anarcho-tyranny we experience increases. It seems ever more that we pay taxes for the privileges of being backhanded by the very authorities who are supposed to be punishing evildoers. 2. Civil government should not treat monies not taxed as if those untaxed monies constitute an act of benevolence to taxpayers. It would be almost humorous to listen to politicians talk as if cutting taxes actually gave money to the people who would be paying less money. Imagine anyone else providing goods and services to you, cutting his prices for whatever reason, and then expecting you to thank him for putting money in your pocket, as if any money he doesn't charge you is a gift of money to you. 3. According to Exodus chapter 30, verse 15, God prohibits the maintenance of differing standards for rich and poor. So, civil government should not require more as a percentage from rich taxpayers than from poor taxpayers. If 20 to 30% is fair for the rich, then it's also fair for the poor. Or, if 2% is fair for the poor, then it's also fair for the rich. 4. To discuss what specific services civil government should or should not perform would require us to look at other passages in some depth, but let's take due note of the fact that St. Paul specifies 2 jobs for the civil government: the punishment of those who do evil and the praise of those who do good. Whatever else civil government may be permitted to do, since it receives payment for the performance of those 2 tasks, the vast majority of its activity should be devoted to those 2 tasks. And 5, since it receives money from taxpayers for its services, civil government probably should not be in the business of creating money or otherwise inflating the money supply and thereby decreasing the purchasing power of money held by taxpayers. Now, concluding this portion of his discussion of the Christian life, St. Paul writes, resuming at verse 7, "Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." All ministers of God, all authorities have certain prerogatives, things they are owed. God is owed worship. Parents are owed obedience and honor. Teachers are owed respect and attention to lessons. Elders and deacons are owed respect and submission. Husbands are owed submission by wives. Wives are owed love by husbands. Governing authorities also have certain privileges: taxes, custom, respect, and honor, and obedience. But just how much obedience? Are we required to do anything and everything the civil government may command? After all, St. Paul clearly says that resisting and opposing the civil government is to resist and oppose God. It staggers the imagination that anyone can think the answer to that question is yes, but there have been those, John MacArthur, for one, that I'm most familiar with. I think if anyone had asked St. Paul that question, he might have replied, "Well, of course not. Don't be silly. Have you not read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they would not worship the golden image? Haven't you read about Daniel in the lion's den? Do you not know why he was thrown into it? Have you not read what St. Peter said to the Sanhedrin when he was commanded not to preach the gospel?" St. Paul no more endorses every act of a governing authority any more than he would endorse every act of a husband on the basis of male headship. Of course, if we disobey the governing authority, we still have to treat it as a governing authority. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, they didn't tell anyone what they could do with that golden image, certainly not Nebuchadnezzar, and they still addressed Nebuchadnezzar as king. Quoting now from Daniel 3, verses 16 through 18. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now, I wouldn't truly be finished with this passage without some attention to present concerns. Clearly, the civil government is God's minister, ordained by God to execute God's justice to punish evildoers as God defines evil. As such, a minister, he is to be no fear to those who do good. Well, what if he is a source of fear? What if, rather than administering God's justice, the civil government administers his own justice, redefines evil and good? What if he apostatizes and transforms his jurisdiction into a state, thus creating his own religious covenant-breaking community, his own apostate mystical body, his own communion of saints in service to some false notion of divinity? What should we do then? Well, the first thing we should do is disabuse ourselves of any notion of seeing much improvement in the lifetime of anyone present here today in the year 2021. By way of explaining why, let me read something to you. Quoting now. "Nationalize as much as possible. All private interests, all local interests, all banking interests, the interests of individuals, everything should be subordinate to the interests of the government." I'm quoting from Heather Cox Richardson, The Greatest Nation on Earth, page 87. Now, shockingly, those words were not spoken by a Democrat in the 20th century. They were spoken by a Republican in the 19th century. Now think of what it means to say, as Senator John Sherman did, that all interests, including the interests of individuals, should be subordinate to the interests of the government. Think of what that means relative to what St. Paul says about the government, and whose interests are supposed to be served, as well as who is supposed to be serving those interests. Think about what it means for that principle of subordination to be at work in our national life for just over 150 years. Not just about policy-related matters. Think what the application of that principle means spiritually. Every interest subordinate to the state. Now, I raise this by way of warning. Depending upon how God decides to work, no one alive today is likely going to see much improvement. Not significant improvement, certainly not the precise sort of improvement that Christians, as opposed to simple garden variety Americans, should want to see. The things we are seeing today did not begin the day after Ronald Reagan left the White House. They were well underway before he got there. These things are not the institution of something new. They are simply the next set of steps, the newest application of the principle of subordination to the government of all interests, especially the individual. All interests, including religion. The coup d'etat that some pundits talk about these days was well underway before the turn of the previous century. Now, the sort of people we're talking about are very committed and very patient. By that I mean most of them fully expect not to see the world they are trying to create. But they are in it for the long haul, mostly because they believe there is a long haul, and also because they are convinced of the inevitability of what they are trying to create. That, and they aren't waiting to be beamed out of here in some rapture so they don't have to fight for anything. We, not so much. For one thing, many Christians, especially those of the dispensational view, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, don't think that there is a long haul, except insofar as the long haul is a long haul of inevitable decline. Of course, things are getting worse. Things are supposed to be getting worse up until the rapture, and then things will be fine. Well, second, in dealing with the question, what can we do, I want to address the issue of we. I want to draw your attention back to where St. Paul began all this, Romans chapter 12. We who ask questions like, what can we do about an apostate government, have to get straight on what we mean by we. If we look back at chapter 12, we find that we are first of all to be those who continually present our bodies to God as living and holy sacrifices. Whatever we do, we are to do as God's priests. We are also supposed to be undergoing transformation by the renewing of our minds, and therefore not conforming to this world. We should be those who love without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. We had better bless those who persecute us, repay evil with good, and refrain from taking revenge, because vengeance belongs to God. We priests, are not to be overcome by evil, but rather to overcome evil with good. We should be seeking above all else to glorify and enjoy God here and now, in anticipation of glorifying Him and enjoying Him in eternity. If we're not clear on all that, if that's not who we are, then we don't need to worry about a godless government. We have bigger things to worry about. If that is who we are, then our answer is a simple one. In fact, we can answer with another question. What should we do in response to any servant who does not perform his duty? We rebuke him and call him to repentance. But, mindful of the lesson in this passage, and recalling Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we should understand that there is a proper way to go about that. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1, Paul tells Timothy to rebuke older men by appealing to them as fathers. Now, in the larger catechism's discussion of the fifth commandment, questions 123 to 133, concerning the honoring of fathers and mothers, question 124 asks, who are meant by father and mother? And the answer is, by father and mother are meant not only natural parents, but all superiors in age and gifts, and especially such as, by God's ordinance, are over us in place of authority, whether in family, church, or commonwealth. And so, we rebuke and call to repentance. We should really see in this passage a tacit exhortation by St. Paul to the evangelization and even conversion of the Roman Empire, including the governing apparatus. This, of course, requires people who are patient, in it for the long haul, at peace with the probability that they will not live to see the world they are working for, which should be easy, since we're looking for a better country anyway, as the writer of Hebrews puts it. Now, many people, especially dispensationalists, and even a few in my Calvinist camp, don't like to talk of converting whole societies. After all, every heart won't be converted. Leaving aside the logical fallacy involved in that sort of objection, many of those who express these doubts also express a desire for revival, oddly enough. Now, this revival is supposed to result in some form of societal transformation. And the others object to the notion of converting whole societies, do so because they believe that if things are getting worse, they're getting worse because end-time prophecy clearly teaches things are supposed to get worse as the rapture approaches. It's a problem if, like me, you don't believe in a rapture. But I digress. It doesn't really matter, though. If there is in this passage a tacit exhortation to evangelize and convert the Roman Empire, as I believe, then it's perfectly consistent with the Great Commission. But we have to guard against doing so simply because we think it's good for society. It may very well be. Naturally, we would think so. In fact, we have to do it simply because we're told to do it. But it all sounds perfunctory, doesn't it? Evangelism. It's cliche to a certain extent. Evangelism is the answer. Evangelism is the cure. Evangelism is the solution to all our problems. If we'd been evangelizing as we should have done, things wouldn't be so bad. If it sounds perfunctory and cliche, it's probably because of the sloppy fashion in which what passes for evangelism has been done for almost 2 centuries, maybe even longer, as I mentioned in a previous podcast. I'll link to that in the description box. Now I'm talking about a rather rushed and sloppy performance of the Great Commission, which focuses on making converts rather than disciples. But as I've said, I've dealt with that in a previous podcast. In my next podcast, whenever that may be, I'll be discussing Christendom and the Kingdom of God. It's been difficult for me to record lately. I lost my studio when we began the 15 days to flatten the curve, and have just managed to scrounge myself out a little corner of the world in which I can record, but I don't know how long I'll have this. Peace be with you.